A dim road seems to run ahead, one never marked on any map. It is a path shaped by absence, by men who should be visible in the record, yet are not. Voices that should echo across diaries, testimonies, camp lists, and post-war interviews, but instead appear only as faint impressions. The Second World War left traces of almost everything: orders, battles, supply routes, casualty figures. But when it comes to black Allied soldiers taken prisoner by German forces, the archival trail narrows to a whisper. That silence is where this story begins. Before you drift too far into the quiet, take a moment to subscribe. It helps this channel grow gently, one listener at a time. And if you'd like, let us know where you're listening from tonight, or which moment lingers with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. Night settles across a landscape familiar only in fragments. Archival shadows, grainy silhouettes, half-remembered stories drifting through the long tale of the war. At the edge of this darkness lies a truth rarely spoken aloud, resting beneath the surface of more common histories, waiting for someone to notice its outline. Wind slips through a stand of broken trees, trunks leaning at uneasy angles after years of artillery shock. Beyond them stretch the front lines as they once were: Normandy hedgerows, Italian ridges, North African deserts, Belgian forests. These places are well rooted in collective memory, and yet thousands of black soldiers fought across those same terrains, often in segregated units, often assigned the most dangerous work, often underestimated by the very armies they served. Their courage was never in question. Their presence was never in question. Their sacrifices were never in question. What is in question is why so many of them seemed to disappear the moment capture occurred. Further ahead, distant points of camp light flicker: stalags, orflogs, dulags, each one a node in the vast machinery of wartime imprisonment. In the final accounting of the conflict, the number of black American POWs officially recorded is startlingly small, given how many served at the front. The silence around them isn't an accident of paperwork or fog of war confusion. It is a silence constructed with intention, shaped by a deeper framework of ideology. Tonight's narrative doesn't rely on shock or spectacle. It moves with a slow, deliberate calm, through policy, battlefield encounters, and the rare testimonies of the men who survived. It lingers with the hard truth that black soldiers were often denied the basic status of prisoner of war. Many were separated from white POWs. Many were diverted to unregistered labor detachments. Many never appeared in any ledger at all. This history is not only about racism, but about how racism became codified into military procedure. The Wehrmacht's relationship to Nazi racial ideology was inconsistent, sometimes opportunistic, sometimes dogmatic. Yet on the matter of black prisoners, the pattern is unmistakable. Their capture was not something the system wanted to acknowledge. Their presence within the POW network was seen as a political risk, a racial challenge, and an ideological inconvenience. The night offers no easy answers, only space. Space to trace the shape of what has been missing. Across that darkness, one can sense the unseen men this story follows: a black infantryman of the 92nd Division taken during fighting in the Apennines, a truck driver ambushed during the Battle of the Bulge, a French colonial soldier captured in 1940. They moved through the war with the same fear and resolve as any other soldier. But the moment they surrendered, their fate diverged. Some were held only briefly. Some were executed. Others were absorbed into labor units without registration. A few survived only because fellow prisoners insisted on shielding them from the system that sought to erase them. Bootsteps crunch faintly over frost somewhere in the distance. Hesitant steps, not marching ones. Men approaching an uncertain future. A guard tower looms in silhouette. It doesn't look overtly menacing, but the structure itself carries the weight of choices made by those who believed they had the authority to determine who counted as a captive worthy of life. This story does not arrive to accuse or dramatize. It arrives to remember, to give form to the pieces that remain, and to understand why they were allowed to slip from sight for so long. The air hangs still, and a quiet question rises with it. How many were taken, and how many were never meant to be seen again? How many families waited for news that never came, not because their loved ones fell in battle, but because the record of their capture was erased before it could ever reach them? The silence surrounding these men is not emptiness. It is the residue of a deliberate system. Attention returns to the dark horizon, to the unseen camps, to the broken lines of movement carved across Europe. The story ahead will not rush. It will unfold gradually, piece by piece. There will be rare documented instances of black POWs entering the German system, and many more where the trail stops abruptly. There will be first-hand accounts from the men who survived interrogations where race dictated everything. There will be glimpses of colonial troops in 1940, whose treatment diverged sharply from that of other prisoners. And there will be evidence of how ordinary German units behaved when ideology collided with the disordered realities of war. The truth is that some histories vanish because no one thought to preserve them. Others vanish because someone worked very hard to ensure they would. Here, tonight, the fragments are gathered. Scattered testimonies, faint records, overlooked details, names that surface only in footnotes. Piece by piece, a history long pushed to the periphery is brought forward, not for spectacle, and not for pain, but for acknowledgement. Ahead lies a road shaped by absence, leading into the quiet places where these men once stood, into the truth of what happened when they were taken prisoner by an army that did not believe they were entitled to the rights of captives. The story begins there. The vanishing point. Dawn rises in muted tones, flattening the horizon into soft layers of grey and pale gold. Beyond that faint hem of light, the war continues, columns shifting, patrols rotating, artillery murmuring in the distance. But here, at this early hour, the world feels momentarily paused. A crossroads lies open to the morning, scarred by tank treads and littered with torn branches, holding its own quiet clue to the silence surrounding black prisoners of war. 3 thin roads branch outward from this junction, each disappearing into a different theatre of conflict. One bends toward Normandy's hedgerow country, where smoke from battles fought months earlier still clings to memory. Another winds toward the Apennines, where winter once settled deep into the ridges. The third traces the routes used during the chaos of 1940, when France fell with astonishing speed. Each road offers part of the story, yet none alone explains why so many captured black soldiers simply vanished from the historical record. A breeze lifts across the broken earth, stirring dust and ash into faint spirals. The motion becomes a quiet metaphor for what historians have followed for decades, evidence rising briefly into view before settling back into obscurity. In battalion rosters, after-action reports, and POW archives, patterns emerge not only of incompleteness but of deliberate omission. Far along one of the roads, a small column of prisoners moves steadily forward, their silhouettes diffused by distance. Most are white Americans or British troops, escorted by German guards whose uniforms soften in the morning haze. It is an orderly scene, predictable, routine. These are the men whose names will appear in camp registries, Red Cross logs, interrogation files. Their captivity will be recorded, counted, and acknowledged. But between their ranks lies an empty space that suggests another truth. Black soldiers served in many of the same units, sometimes in the same companies or attached to the same frontline operations. Yet when German units processed prisoners, black captives often disappeared before reaching the camps. Sometimes the cause was brutally straightforward, racist policy applied unevenly but widely understood. Sometimes it was the prejudice of individual soldiers or officers. At other moments, it was bureaucratic. Decisions made by men who viewed racial ideology as part of their administrative duty. The Geneva Convention defined rules for the treatment of prisoners of war, but those rules existed beside an unwritten system, ideological, selective, and shaped by the racial worldview of the regime. Those hidden rules influenced who was recognized as a legitimate captive, who was transferred onward, who survived the journey into custody, and who vanished from all documentation. Near the shoulder of the road, a scattering of abandoned helmets bears marks of recent movement. Among them lies a single American liner bearing the faint trace of a unit marking used by segregated service troops during the Battle of the Bulge. Its presence without its owner becomes a small but potent symbol. Men captured in the chaos who never appeared in any German intake report. Not listed as prisoners. Not listed as casualties. Simply absent. German handling of black POWs was inconsistent. A few were processed through standard channels, though typically under harsher conditions. Others were separated from white prisoners, classified as labor assets rather than soldiers, or held temporarily in unregistered sites. Some were executed at the moment of surrender, a violation of the laws of war but consistent with the regime's ideology. The lack of records complicates everything. Few testimonies survive, and German documentation seldom mentions these men, sometimes intentionally. Along the empty space where they should be walking, the silence becomes tangible, not the quiet of dawn but the quiet of erasure. A lone tree stands at the crossroads, its bark torn by shrapnel, branches stripped into angular points. It feels like a solitary marker for those who passed through and never returned. The landscape seems to wait for footsteps that never arrive, for the crunch of gravel that should accompany a fuller column of captives. Down the road, the guard detachment turns toward a staging area. An officer gestures and divides the prisoners into two groups. One will continue toward a formal stalag, the other will remain temporarily for interrogation. This sorting process happened thousands of times, efficient, procedural, and seemingly impartial. Yet embedded within these simple movements were choices that determined the fate of black captives. Some were pulled aside. Others were ignored entirely. Some were redirected to field labor without registration, disappearing in the movements of retreat and counterattack. The moment here is not a recreation of a single event, but a composite of many, drawn from witness accounts, court records, Red Cross reports, and post-war interviews. Each fragment offers a detail: a sergeant last seen alive at the moment of capture who never reached Stalag 9B, a truck driver from the Red Ball Express missing from the group he surrendered with, French colonial troops separated from European prisoners as early as 1940. The silence grows out of these individual absences. One missing name can be overlooked. 10 missing names can be excused. But across the entire war, the pattern becomes undeniable. The number of black Allied soldiers unaccounted for in the POW system far exceeds anything the battlefield alone can explain. Behind the crossroads lies the memory of footsteps, those that should be here and are not, those the record should preserve but doesn't. Ahead, the path curves toward the first documented case studies, the rare instances where black prisoners emerged from the system with testimonies that illuminate the fate of men who left no trace. Morning light thickens, and the vanishing point stretches into view, across front lines, across continents, across years. This first chapter begins by acknowledging the weight of what is missing, not only the men themselves, but the narrative space denied to them. What the records didn't say. The road bends gently away from the crossroads, narrowing into a corridor between low ridges. Morning light softens as it filters through a thin mist that gathers around anything forgotten. Ahead, the landscape shifts into a quieter, more introspective place, an archive of sorts, built not from paper or ink, but from everything the official records failed to hold. A small clearing opens where several paths converge. Scattered across the ground lie objects half buried in the soil: a broken buckle, a snapped rifle sling, a scrap of canvas, the corner of a dog tag worn nearly smooth. Each fragment feels like a footnote to a story whose main text was never written. They belong to men whose enlistment papers exist, whose training logs remain intact, whose battalion rosters are complete, yet whose wartime fate dissolves abruptly after the moment of capture. Near the center of the clearing rests a rusted canteen stamped with a U.S. quartermaster code. It could have belonged to anyone. But here, in a landscape defined by absence, it becomes a symbol of a larger question. How does one trace the fate of soldiers who were deliberately excluded from the systems meant to protect them? The official German POW registers, the Kriegsgefangenenkarte, were designed to be exhaustive. Names, serial numbers, capture dates, camp assignments. Most Allied prisoners appear in these records with bureaucratic precision. And yet, when historians search for black prisoners in the same archives, the trail thins almost immediately. Segregated units saw combat from North Africa to Western Europe, but the number of black POW entries barely rises into double digits. Early researchers assumed clerical chaos. But as decades passed, a clearer pattern emerged. The system functioned effectively for those it was built to acknowledge. Those outside its ideological frame were filtered out, diverted, or handled through channels that avoided formal documentation. A gust of wind shifts the leaves, revealing the corner of a German field order buried beneath them. The ink has faded, but a few lines remain legible, references to special categories of prisoners to be treated according to standing racial guidelines. The wording varied across units, but the intent was consistent. Black soldiers were not merely enemies in uniform. They were, in the regime's eyes, racial threats. This belief shaped interrogations, assignments, transfers, and even whether a man was granted the protections of POW status at all. Policy and practice diverged widely. Official Wehrmacht regulations did not explicitly mandate violence against black prisoners, and some officers insisted on applying Geneva Convention protections. But ideology seeped through the structure. Propaganda labeled black troops as symbols of American degeneracy, while pseudoscientific racial theories cast them as inferior or dangerous. Many German units interpreted these ideas as permission, if not instruction, to disregard normal rules of war. The gaps in the record were not accidental. In some field units, black captives were never registered because registration implied acknowledgement, an ideological contradiction. In other cases, initial paperwork was completed but quietly discarded before reaching higher command. Bureaucratic pathways were manipulated to ensure certain men never entered the system. Erasure took the form of missing lines, omitted entries, unfiled documents. In the imagined quiet of a field office, a German clerk sorts through forms at a wooden table. Outside, prisoners stand in line beneath guard supervision. One by one, their details are recorded: name, rank, serial number, unit, capture date. But when a black soldier steps forward, hesitation follows. Sometimes nothing is written. Sometimes only a number. Sometimes the man is redirected to an alternate category: laborer, unknown, or special case. These channels led nowhere. No Red Cross oversight, no camp assignment, no traceable route through captivity. Along the ridge overlooking the clearing, the valley spreads into view. It becomes easy to see how many small decisions accumulated into a systemic pattern. A patrol captures 3 men but reports only 2. A transport officer separates black captives and sends them to rear area labor detachments without updating rosters. A field commander interprets racial ideology as justification to deny POW status entirely. None of these moments were documented. Yet together, they formed the vanishing point that defines this history. A road cuts across the valley below, lined with remnants of barbed wire and broken posts. It resembles one of the paths used to move prisoners between holding sites. Along that route, it is possible to imagine a quiet procession that never reached the camps, men walking with raised hands, escorted by guards who already knew these captives would not appear on any register. The silence surrounding their fate was not incidental. It was constructed, one decision at a time. The mist thickens, giving the landscape the quality of a memory returning only in outline. In that haze lies the answer to how an entire group could be pushed out of history. The machinery of documentation was never designed to include them. Yet traces survive. Some testimonies remain, scattered interviews, fragments of memoirs, recollections from white prisoners who witnessed what happened. A few speak of black soldiers separated at gunpoint. Others recall small groups marched away, never to be seen again. One POW remembered a man from a segregated unit who reached the camp only because his fellow prisoners refused to let the guards remove him. These accounts do not form a complete record, but together they reveal what the official paperwork concealed. At the edge of the clearing, a slow heaviness settles over the landscape. Not the heaviness of fear or shock, but the quiet weight of something missing for a long time. The next chapter moves toward the rare cases that broke through the silence. Moments when black prisoners did enter the POW system, leaving behind fragments that help illuminate the fate of many more. When the system was forced to see them. The road widens as the next chapter opens, the fog lifting just enough to reveal a landscape the German prisoner system rarely wished to acknowledge. Faint grid lines mark the outline of an old transit point, a dulag, one of the temporary processing stations where captives were screened before being sent deeper into the network of stalags and offlogs. These sites functioned like intake funnels, structured, methodical, designed to account for every man who passed through. But the experience of black prisoners who reached these points often diverged sharply from the expected pattern. At the edge of the clearing lie the remains of a foundation, stones half submerged in soil, marking where interrogation rooms once stood. These were small wooden structures built for speed rather than comfort. Officers sat behind makeshift desks, flipping through forms, asking questions about unit strength, equipment, morale. Most prisoners moved through quickly. Their answers were recorded, their identities confirmed, and their transfer orders prepared. For white prisoners, this step marked the beginning of captivity. For black prisoners, those rare few who reached this stage, it was the start of something far more fraught. A gust of wind rolls across the broken foundation, carrying with it the faint echo of conversations now long vanished. The tension of those interrogations lingers in the air. A black soldier seated beneath a hanging bulb, German officers regarding him with a mixture of curiosity, ideological unease, and suspicion. These encounters were not always violent, but they were charged. Race shaped the questions asked, the tone adopted, and the outcomes that followed. And yet, despite the ideological rigidity of the regime, some black prisoners did enter the system. Their presence exposes the cracks in a structure that appeared uniform but was never truly cohesive. Along a weathered trail, the remnants of a crude wooden barrier rise from the earth, once used to separate groups of prisoners. Beyond it lies the route towards Stalag 9B, one of the few camps known to have received small numbers of black American soldiers. Their journey into captivity was rarely straightforward. Surviving testimonies recount long marches during which guards debated openly what to do with them. Some advocated immediate execution. Others hesitated, unsure whether such actions were sanctioned. In several cases, fate turned on the interpretation of a single officer present at the moment of capture or transit. One documented instance describes a German sergeant who insisted the men be treated like any other prisoners until he received explicit orders to the contrary. Those orders never arrived. Whether through oversight, exhaustion, or miscommunication, The captives were moved onward. They reached the camp dirty, exhausted, and watched warily by guards unaccustomed to seeing black soldiers in their custody. Moments like these reveal the friction between ideology and reality. The Wehrmacht valued discipline and structure. Yet the presence of black prisoners disrupted that internal narrative, forcing officers to make choices the larger system preferred to avoid. The terrain opens into a broad stretch of ground where temporary holding pens once stood. Wooden posts jut from the soil, some leaning, others snapped. Here, prisoners huddled through the harsh winters of 1944 and 1945, waiting to learn their fate. Among them, a few black soldiers stood out, not by choice, but because the system treated them as anomalies. Within Stalag 9B, guards reacted with a mixture of uncertainty and hostility. Some segregated the men instinctively, placing them alongside Soviet prisoners or others considered inferior by Nazi racial ideology. Others allowed them to remain with their American comrades, though often under sharper scrutiny. Even here, within formal structures, the presence of black captives barely appeared in the paperwork. Their names emerged only sporadically, sometimes only because another prisoner insisted on recording them. Quiet testimonies from those who shared these spaces offer rare glimpses into their experience. One white POW remembered a black soldier who refused to let guards separate him from the others. Another recalled a man from a truck company who survived only because European prisoners formed a protective circle around him during transport, making it harder for guards to isolate him. Acts of solidarity, small but decisive, became lifelines in a system built to erase. A breeze carries the lingering chill of the winter of 1944 across the empty ground. It is easy to imagine the layered emotions of the men who reached these camps: relief at surviving long enough to arrive, fear about what came next, confusion at being allowed forward when so many others vanished before reaching any gate. What stands out is not merely the rarity of these cases, but the fragility of the decisions that shaped them. A different officer in the patrol, a different clerk at the Gulag, a different interpretation of an unwritten directive. Any small shift could have led to an entirely different outcome. White prisoners never had to consider such variables. For black captives, these variables determined survival itself. Across the old camp footprint, bare earth where barracks once stood, rusty nails scattered among roots, faint impressions of fence lines dissolving into the grass, the system's contradictions become visible. In this place, the German prisoner network was forced to confront what it preferred to avoid. The presence of men who did not fit its ideology yet could not be eliminated without leaving evidence. These rare cases illuminate the broader truth. Black prisoners were occasionally processed, but always as exceptions. Their records were sparse, their treatment inconsistent, their survival uncertain. Yet these isolated stories matter deeply. They provide the fragments needed to understand what happened to the many whose names never entered the system at all. Ahead lies Part B, where specific accounts come into focus. Men who survived captivity, men who witnessed the treatment of others, and the testimonies that reveal how close these histories came to disappearing entirely. Rare voices, fragile evidence. Frost clings to the earth in pale ribbons along the perimeter of the old camp footprint, the landscape quiet in a way that heightens the meaning of what once occurred here. This is where the traces of black prisoners become clearer, still faint, still fragile, but visible enough to follow. Their stories do not live in thick ledgers or detailed archival reports. Instead, they survive through memories, fragments of testimony, and the recollections of others who refuse to forget what they witnessed. A narrow trench runs along the edge of the field, now filled with dried leaves and brittle twigs. During the war, it carried runoff from the barracks. Now it resembles a channel of forgotten stories, each leaf a small piece of evidence swept to the margins of history. Moving alongside it, the fragility of these stories becomes unmistakable. How easily they might have disappeared entirely had a few voices chosen not to speak. One such voice begins with a man named James Hendricks, a truck driver from a segregated service unit caught in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. His convoy splintered under artillery fire, and Hendricks was captured alongside white soldiers who later appeared in POW records. Hendricks himself did not. His presence survives only because others recalled him during the march to the rear. In their accounts, he appears in flashes, helping a wounded comrade, struggling to keep pace, then being pulled aside by guards who argued about his fate. The survivors never saw him again. His name appears nowhere in German logs. His story lingers as evidence, not of confusion, but of filtration. Further along the valley, memories of another group of prisoners surface, men trudging through deep snow near the Siegfried Line. Among them was Private Lawrence Neal, whose testimony emerged decades later in an oral history project. Neal was one of the very few black American soldiers to describe life inside a German camp. He spoke with steady clarity about the confusion etched onto the faces of the guards who processed him. They had not expected to find a black soldier among the captives. Their uncertainty led to low, tense arguments across the intake table. Neal was initially placed with white American POWs. That arrangement lasted only until a new guard commander arrived. Ordered into a separate compound, one used for Soviet prisoners and others deemed racially inferior, Neal recalled walking through the camp like someone they hadn't planned for. His account survived only because a historian recorded it before memory faded. Without that conversation, a crucial piece of evidence about racial sorting inside the camps would have vanished. A low rise overlooks the old transport route connecting this camp to others across central Germany. Prisoners once passed along this path in long, slow convoys. Scattered testimonies from white POWs contain fleeting references to black soldiers who traveled with them for part of the journey, only to disappear at junctions or small holding sites where guards made decisions out of sight of any record-keeping. One such memory comes from Edward Mann, an infantryman captured during the Bulge. Mann marched beside a black medic who had been seized while tending to wounded men. The medic tried to remain with the column, but guards debated his fate in clear view of the prisoners. Twice he was taken aside, and twice he returned when instructions proved unclear. The third time, he did not return. Mann searched for the man's name in POW rosters for years. He found nothing. These small absences, repeated across countless accounts, form a pattern stronger than any single document. These men existed vividly in memory, yet nowhere in the administrative structure meant to track their captivity. The French experience provides another fragment. During the German advance in 1940, thousands of tirailleurs Senegalese, West African colonial troops fighting for France, were captured. Some were massacred, reflecting the racial ideology driving portions of the Wehrmacht. Others were segregated, denied POW rights, or forced into labor battalions. A few reached camps, but even there their presence was minimized. Officers often listed them under broad categories like colonial troops, avoiding ethnic identification as though acknowledging their individuality contradicted the hierarchy they sought to enforce. In the imagined silence of the camp yard, it becomes easy to picture these men standing under guard, their fates decided by policies that treated them not as soldiers, but as exceptions unworthy of recognition. Another testimony drifts from the far side of the ruined barracks. It belongs to Harold Ferguson, who survived captivity in late 1944. Ferguson recalled seeing a black American soldier in a transit pen during processing, a man cold, trembling, his uniform ripped. Ferguson asked his name, but the prisoner shook his head, either unable to speak or unwilling to draw notice. Within minutes, guards escorted him away. Ferguson tried to follow, but another captive held him back. No one saw the man again. Ferguson's recollection became the only evidence that soldier existed. Without it, the man would have disappeared without even a single line of written trace. These fragments settle into place with a quiet weight. Individually, none forms a complete history. They cannot. The system was designed to obscure, not document. But together, they expose how close these stories came to erasure, and how vital even the faintest testimony becomes in reconstructing what happened. The path now leads toward a broader examination of the ideology that shaped these outcomes, a look at how racial logic, codified and enforced, dictated policy and paved the way for disappearance. Understanding that logic is essential for understanding why so many stories look like this: fragmented, fragile, nearly lost. The ideology behind the silence. Farther from the remnants of the camp, the landscape widens into a plain washed in pale winter light. The ground appears quiet, almost untouched, yet a tension lingers beneath the stillness, a reminder that silence can be constructed, shaped, and enforced. To understand why so many black prisoners never entered the German POW system, the path must run through the mindset of the regime that controlled it. Here, ideology becomes terrain. Earth mounds rise ahead, marking the former site of field headquarters from the early years of the war. The structures have long since vanished, but their outlines remain, shallow rectangles pressed into the soil like empty frames waiting for meaning. Decisions were once made here, orders drafted, instructions clarified, interpretations shaped. The men who worked inside these spaces rarely put their assumptions into writing, yet those assumptions seeped into every directive they issued. At the core of those assumptions lay racial ideology. The Nazi worldview arranged humanity into rigid hierarchies, placing Aryans at the top and ranking everyone else according to imagined biological worth. In this construct, black people occupied one of the lowest positions. Propaganda reinforced these beliefs relentlessly, portraying black men as physically strong but intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, or prone to violence, caricatures drawn from colonial myth rather than reality. The regime embraced these ideas not reluctantly but enthusiastically. They fit neatly into the ideological architecture Hitler sought to impose on Europe. Cold air moves across the outlines of the old headquarters, carrying with it the echo of that worldview. Officers stationed here operated not only with military logic, but under the weight of a system that told them black soldiers were fundamentally different from their white counterparts. Different in ways that mattered. Different in ways that demanded response. This mindset began shaping German attitudes long before black troops were captured. Military journals warned that the United States relied on inferior races to wage war against the Reich. Propaganda films and pamphlets described black soldiers as undisciplined, cruel, or symbols of foreign moral decay. It was fiction, crafted for political effect, but it shaped expectations among the soldiers who would later confront black troops in battle. When those same soldiers captured black Americans or black colonial forces, they viewed them through the lens propaganda had created. Confusion mixed with hostility. The question arose: should these men be treated as legitimate combatants or as something entirely outside the laws of war? The Geneva Convention made no racial distinction. Nazi ideology did. For many officers, ideology felt more authoritative than international law. Another line of low mounds appears. These once housed signals equipment and filing cabinets. The documents that pass through here are gone, but their shadows linger in the imagination. Among the directives issued in places like this were guidelines concerning foreign elements within the Allied armies. These instructions were intentionally vague. They did not explicitly command mistreatment, but they allowed commanders to interpret the status of black prisoners however they wished. Ambiguity became a weapon, quiet, flexible, and potent. In that ambiguity, countless fates were sealed. Black soldiers captured in ambushes or skirmishes often encountered officers who believed that granting them POW status acknowledged the legitimacy of the United States' use of what the regime called undesirable races. To avoid this ideological contradiction, many officers chose not to register them. Others diverted them to rear labor detachments, bypassing the formal POW system entirely. Some interpreted the absence of clear instruction as permission for brutality. Each decision was small on its own. Together, they created the wide shadow of absence that defines this narrative. A narrow path leads up a rise overlooking the plain. From this vantage point, it becomes clear how ideology spread across the military landscape, not through constant coercion, but through repetition. Soldiers heard the same racial messages in barracks lectures, training materials, and political discussions. By the time they encountered black soldiers on the battlefield, many believed they were confronting men who fell outside the normal framework of warfare. Even officers who disagreed found themselves navigating a system that offered no clear path toward equal treatment. The result was inconsistency. Some German officers ignored ideology and processed black prisoners normally. Others followed the racial hierarchy rigidly. Many occupied a nebulous space between the two, allowing personal prejudice or unit culture to determine their actions. The diversity of responses complicates the historical record, but the overall pattern remains unmistakable. The vast majority of black captives never entered the camp system, and those who did often faced harsher conditions than their white peers. The ideological terrain presses gently around the rise, subtle, structural, and steady rather than dramatic. The silence that followed black prisoners into captivity was not born of confusion or battlefield chaos. It was the silence of a worldview applied methodically, one decision at a time. Ahead lies a deeper examination of how these ideological currents translated into practice across different fronts, how officers carried these beliefs from France to Italy, and how those beliefs determined the fate of the men they captured. Ideology in the field. The plain ahead narrows into a corridor framed by low stone walls, remnants of pre-war farming boundaries that survived the conflict in fragments. As the path moves between them, the air grows heavier, more grounded, as though the land itself remembers how ideology played out far from headquarters, in the fields, forests, and shattered towns where soldiers made decisions shaped as much by belief as by circumstance. This is where theory turned into practice. A shallow depression appears in the soil, the faint outline of a foxhole long reclaimed by time. It evokes the early phases of the Battle of the Bulge. Thick snow, frantic movements, confusion twisting through the woods. In that chaos, black American soldiers, drivers, medics, support personnel, were caught in sudden skirmishes while assisting frontline units. Many fought until ammunition ran out. Some surrendered. Others lay wounded as German patrols swept forward. In these moments, ideology did not present itself as doctrine or slogans. It appeared in the choices of individual soldiers who believed black captives were not entitled to equal treatment. Some acted with immediate hostility, sharpened by years of propaganda. Others hesitated, uncertain, aware their manuals did not explicitly address racial handling, yet influenced by a worldview drilled into them long before they reached the battlefield. Footsteps can almost be imagined crunching across thick snow, accompanied by murmured arguments in German. One soldier might insist on standard processing. Another might argue for segregation. A third might dismiss the man entirely, viewing him as a laborer rather than a soldier, stripping him of legal status with a single classification. These clashes of interpretation occurred repeatedly, shaping the immediate experience of black prisoners in ways no written directive ever acknowledged. Farther along, the corridor widens into a clearing scattered with twisted metal and stone, perhaps the remnants of a supply point or temporary intelligence site. Officers once examined captured maps and documents here. White prisoners were questioned predictably. 4 black captives. Interrogation often unfolded under a cloud of racial presumption. Some interrogators expressed disbelief that the United States deployed black troops in significant numbers. Others accused them of being instruments of American degeneracy, repeating propaganda with practiced certainty. These ideological assumptions colored both the questions asked and the fate assigned afterward. Men dismissed as inferior were frequently redirected into labor detachments or handed off to rear units without documentation. The path curves toward a ridge overlooking a valley reminiscent of central France in 1940, where black colonial troops from West Africa fought alongside French units. Their courage during the German invasion challenged deeply ingrained racist beliefs within the Wehrmacht. The response was often brutal. In multiple recorded cases, captured tirailleurs Senegalese were executed. These killings were not mandated by formal high command orders. Instead, they reflected the racial ideology woven into the culture of many German formations. Officers interpreted propaganda and the regime's broader worldview as justification for acts that violated the laws of war. Those who survived initial capture were frequently segregated, denied POW rights, or forced into punishing labor details. Across the ridge, echoes of those decisions linger. A faint chill hangs in the air, stretching back to those days when ideology and personal action fused into a pattern repeated across villages, fields, and makeshift holding areas. It was not systematic in the bureaucratic sense. It was systematic in its consistency, a worldview reproduced by individual hands. A narrow descent leads into terrain reminiscent of Italy's mountainous landscape. During the long Italian campaign, black American units, engineers, truck companies, support detachments, often operated near the front. When captured, their treatment varied sharply depending on which German formation held authority. Older Wehrmacht divisions sometimes adhered more closely to Geneva rules and processed captives without overt hostility. Other formations, particularly those influenced by SS ideology or steeped in propaganda, treated black prisoners as outside the protections of war. Near the base of the slope, the remains of a collapsed wooden shelter lie scattered, a temporary barracks or storage structure. In the accounts of white American POWs, scenes like this surface occasionally. A black soldier held apart from others, guarded more harshly, or interrogated repeatedly about why he served in the U.S. Army. Some guards expressed confusion. Others expressed disdain. Treatment varied according to the beliefs of the men in control, not according to law. In the distance, the trace of a long road cuts across the valley, one resembling logistical routes used to funnel prisoners toward stalags. Few black prisoners walked these routes. Those who did often reached them by chance, carried forward because their captors did not know what else to do. Their presence exposed the rule by becoming exceptions. Along this imaginary road, the ideological fracture becomes stark. If a guard believed a black captive was not a real soldier, the POW framework collapsed instantly. The captive became a laborer, an inferior, or a body removed without record. The Geneva Convention required mutual recognition. Racist ideology refused to grant it. The landscape stretches under a muted sky. Each ridge, hollow, and ruin represents countless decisions shaped by belief. Not one directive explains the pattern. Not one centralized policy accounts for the disappearances. Instead, the fate of black prisoners was determined in the quiet spaces between orders, where ideology seeped into practice, guiding instincts, shaping reactions, narrowing the definition of who counted. Ahead, the path moves toward the next chapter, where individual stories emerge more clearly. What the system did, what the men inside it endured, and how survival sometimes depended on chance, solidarity, or a single unpredictable decision. Into the uncertain holding sites. The terrain ahead shifts again, narrowing into a crooked lattice of dirt paths winding through a landscape shaped by temporary decisions, places never meant to last, yet significant enough to alter the lives of countless men. These were the holding sites, the in-between spaces where prisoners waited before they were processed, transferred, or erased from the system entirely. For most Allied soldiers, these stops were brief. For many black prisoners, they marked the end of the documented trail. A clearing emerges where a wooden fence once stood. Only a few weathered posts remain, jutting from the frost-hardened earth like ribs. The ground is uneven, stamped into trampled mud where dozens of feet once passed. This was the kind of place where captives gathered under guard while officers decided their fate. Sometimes the wait lasted hours, sometimes days, and sometimes the men who stood here were never seen again. The stillness in this space feels weighted, as though the land absorbed the uncertainty of the prisoners who once crowded these pens, cold, exhausted, disoriented after surrender, grasping for any indication of what awaited them. Among these men were black soldiers who startled their captors. Many German troops had never encountered black Americans or colonial African soldiers. Even those who were influenced by propaganda that depicted them as aberrations, illegitimate combatants, or evidence of the Allies' supposed decline. This ideological confusion manifested in small, consequential moments. Guards debated segregation. They questioned whether black soldiers qualified as lawful prisoners. They argued about whether these captives should be processed, diverted into forced labor, or handled through entirely informal channels. None of these debates were recorded. They unfolded in low voices around small campfires, in the muttered exchanges of patrol leaders, in the brisk decisions of officers who believed their racial assumptions carried the force of law. Farther along, the landscape opens into a shallow depression, once a staging area for prisoner columns. A trench runs along one side, now filled with dead grass. This was where groups were formed and sent out, divided by nationality, rank, and anticipated intelligence value. But the presence of black soldiers disrupted that order. White Americans were sorted with precision. British and French captives were separated from one another. Officers were channeled into distinct groups. Black soldiers defied these categories. Surviving testimonies describe scenes like this. A black medic standing alone as guards argued over whether he belonged in a stalag or a labor crew. A French colonial soldier questioned repeatedly about his loyalty, as though fighting for France violated some natural rule. A driver from the Red Ball Express placed with Soviet prisoners because guards assumed they belonged together. None of these moments was large in scale, yet together they formed a pattern rooted in ideology and enacted by individuals, never corrected, never questioned by the system surrounding them. A soft wind slips across the depression, lifting strands of dry grass. Beyond it lies a row of half-buried stones, the foundation of a long-vanished guard post. Inside such structures, guards logged names, noted injuries, and recorded serial numbers for most captives. But the surviving paperwork shows gaps, pages left blank, incomplete rosters, lists that skip multiple entries without explanation. Historians examining these records noticed a disturbing correlation. Many omissions corresponded to units known to include black soldiers. The silence in the documents was not arbitrary. It reflected the ideology of the men who controlled the pen. A hill rises beyond the clearing, offering a view of the region's prisoner routes. From this vantage point, the broader flow becomes easier to imagine. Columns of Americans, Britons, and French marched along roads cutting through forests and villages, guarded by small detachments. Most eventually reached established camps. But smaller groups, especially those that included black captives, were diverted into holding sites like the one below. Sometimes they were kept separate. Sometimes they were moved irregularly to unknown destinations. and sometimes they simply vanished from all traceable records. A few accounts from white POWs cast faint light on these disappearances. One described a black soldier taken away by guards for additional questioning, only for days to pass before anyone realized he had not appeared at the Stalag. Another remembered a rear detachment of black prisoners marching behind the main column. When the group reached the camp, the rear contingent was gone. These stories are few, but they echo one another. They depict spaces where ideology and improvisation met, where guards, lacking clear directives, acted according to prejudice, fear, or ingrained belief. Sometimes the outcome was forced labor. In other instances, it was far worse. The clearing lies silent beneath the winter light. No plaques mark the ground. No memorials stand here. The earth itself is the only remaining witness. In this quiet, the fragility of the decisions made in such places becomes palpable. How easily they could redirect a life, how quietly a man could slip into the silence of unrecorded history. Ahead, the path descends toward the next region of the holding network, places where a few black prisoners survived long enough to be transferred, allowing the next step of their journey to be traced. The narrow gate to survival. The path leading away from the holding site enters a narrower corridor lined with frost-coated trees, their bare limbs casting thin shadows across the ground. The landscape feels like a threshold, one that only a small number of black prisoners ever crossed. Those who survived the holding sites and slipped into the formal POW system did so not because the system accepted them, but because a series of uncertain decisions aligned just long enough to let them pass through. The ground along the corridor is uneven, marked by old wagon ruts and hardened mud. These faint traces hint at the small groups of prisoners once ushered forward to the next stage, men unsure whether the road ahead meant recognition, exploitation, or disappearance. For most white soldiers, this route followed a predictable arc. For black prisoners, it remained precarious, shaped by forces far beyond their control. Ahead, the corridor widens into a clearing bordered by the remnants of low stone walls. This was likely a secondary staging point, a place where captives waited before being marched to railway depots or moved to local camps. For the few black soldiers who reached this step, the moment represented a narrow gateway, one that might allow their entry into the official system if the balance of circumstances tilted just right. The tension that must have permeated this place is easy to imagine. Guards pacing, prisoners huddled for warmth, officers cross-checking lists under dim lantern light. Decisions in such spaces were made through a blend of fatigue, bias, and logistical pressure. The future of a black prisoner could hinge on which officer happened to be present, and how rigidly he chose to apply ideological assumptions that were never clearly codified. One such moment survives through testimony, the case of Private Samuel Carter, whose fate depended entirely on the variability of individual interpretation. Captured during the winter fighting in the Ardennes, Carter spent a night in a makeshift pen much like the one behind this clearing. Guards argued over how he should be treated. Some insisted on separation, others questioned whether racial policy applied during a chaotic retreat. At dawn, a new officer arrived, glanced at Carter, and ordered the entire group to move forward with no special instructions. Carter lived because, at that moment, efficiency overshadowed ideology. Deeper in the clearing, the faint outline of a drainage ditch holds a thin layer of frost. Along its edges lie impressions in the soil, old footprints blurred by time yet still recognizable. These traces evoke another pathway to survival, the quiet protection offered by fellow prisoners. Several testimonies recall moments when white American or French soldiers intervened as guards attempted to remove black captives. Some prisoners refused to move until their comrades were allowed to remain. Others shielded a black soldier within their formation, making it harder for guards to identify and extract him. These acts of solidarity were understated but decisive. They disrupted the ideological chain long enough to redirect a fate that had nearly been sealed. One American POW remembered walking beside a black engineer during a march. When guards tried to pull the engineer from the line, the surrounding prisoners locked their arms, refusing to break formation. Outnumbered and confused, the guard relented. The engineer survived the march because the men around him quietly refused to yield to ideological sorting. At the far side of the clearing, the remnants of a collapsed wooden gate lie half buried in soil. This gate once marked the exit point from the staging area, the threshold beyond which prisoners were sent toward more permanent facilities. Crossing it did not guarantee safety, but it increased the likelihood of appearing in the official record. Only a small fraction of black prisoners ever crossed this line. Those who did often faced more severe treatment in the camps that followed. Guards assigned them grueling labor, sometimes housing them with Soviet prisoners or among groups labeled undesirable rather than with their own units. Even so, entering the system created a trace, a name in a ledger, a mention in a testimony, a sliver of documentation in a history otherwise marked by silence. Beyond the gate, a faint railway embankment rises, now overgrown with brush and weeds. During the war, this rail line served as the artery through which POWs moved deeper into German-controlled territory. The trains were overcrowded and bitterly cold, dreaded by nearly all who boarded them. But for black prisoners, boarding a train meant begrudging acknowledgement by the administrative system, a recognition often denied to others before them. Survivors described these journeys in fragments. One man remembered being offered the driest corner of a cattle car by white American prisoners determined to shield him from further harm. Another recalled the restrained bewilderment of guards who had never encountered a black POW before, some suspicious, others uncertain, a few merely curious. These encounters, however awkward, represented a fragile step toward inclusion within a system built to exclude. At the railway embankment, the stillness carries the memory of those narrow escapes. Survival required a convergence of unlikely forces, a guard who hesitated, a clerk who followed procedure instead of ideology, comrades who intervened, an officer more concerned with logistics than doctrine. Each factor nudged the narrative toward a fragile form of recognition. But even those who passed through this narrow gateway understood how tenuous their circumstances remained. Every step deeper into the camp network carried uncertainty, shadowed by the knowledge that ideology could reassert itself at any moment. Entry into the system did not guarantee survival. It merely extended the possibility. Beyond the embankment, the path bends toward the next stage of the story, a closer examination of the camps themselves, the internal structures that shaped daily life, and the ways black POWs navigated a network never designed to include them. Inside the camps that weren't meant for them. The path rises gently before dipping into a broad, flattened basin, the kind of landscape that once held the rigid geometry of a POW camp. Even though the barracks have collapsed and the wire has long since rusted into the soil, the ground still carries the imprint of what stood here. Rows, angles, corridors of movement. Near the perimeter lies the faint line where a fence marked the boundary between captivity and everything beyond it. The place is quiet, but not empty. The silence carries the memory of morning roll calls, the clatter of boots along frozen dirt, the layered murmur of conversations in dozens of languages. This was the world most Allied POWs entered after capture, predictable in its routines, monitored by the Red Cross, guided by international convention. But for the few black prisoners who crossed into this space, the experience often sat slightly out of alignment with the rhythms around them. At the imprint of the main gate, once the entry point for new arrivals, white American troops marched through in orderly files, heads lowered, absorbing the reality of captivity. Their presence was expected. Guards knew which barracks to assign, which ledgers to update, which procedures to follow. The arrival of a black prisoner disrupted this rhythm. Guards hesitated. Officers exchanged glances. Clerks rechecked their lists as though confronted with a detail the paperwork had failed to anticipate. The camp system had established processes for British, American, French, Polish, and Soviet prisoners. It had separate barracks for officers and enlisted men. It held categories for medical cases, labor assignments, and disciplinary actions. But it had no category for Black Americans. Ideology, not logistics, created that absence. The outline of the administrative hut appears nearby, dark soil marking where wooden beams once framed the doorway. Inside, clerks with fountain pens recorded each prisoner's name, rank, and serial number in neat handwriting. 4 black soldiers. This moment was charged with uncertainty. Some clerks paused before writing anything. Others noted racial descriptors: negger, colored, unknown origin, as if identifying the man racially were more important than identifying him militarily. Surviving German records often list these men without unit affiliation, without rank, or with entire fields left blank. The hesitance embedded in these documents reflects the tension that unfolded at the hut's threshold: a clerk's uncertain pen, a guard's puzzled expression, a prisoner waiting in silence as the system attempted to fit him into categories it had never intended to hold. Beyond the hut lies the faint grid of barracks that once formed a small wooden city. The earth dips where floors once rested. Narrow paths stretch between the outlines of buildings. This area housed American enlisted men, crowded, cold, and austere, yet governed by familiar routines. White prisoners described straw mattresses, thin blankets, and food shortages that left many perpetually hungry. Black prisoners who reached these same spaces often encountered an added layer of isolation. Some stayed briefly among white Americans until guards intervened or other prisoners expressed prejudice. Others were moved to barracks with Soviet prisoners, a group treated harshly and denied Geneva protections. The inconsistency revealed a deeper truth. The system did not know where to place men who fell outside its ideological framework. Near a shallow trough where drainage once collected, ice once formed in jagged layers during the winter of 1944. A survivor recalled seeing a black prisoner standing alone beside this trough, shivering, unsure whether he was permitted to enter a barracks or expected to remain apart. No guard offered direction. No fellow prisoner stepped forward. In that moment, the man stood between categories, visible yet unclaimed. Farther along lies the outline of the labor assignment area, where guards selected prisoners for work details: rail repair, logging, factory shifts, road clearing. Many black prisoners were pushed into these groups immediately, bypassing the routines and rites of the main camp. Work detachments operated at the fringes of the system, with less oversight and fewer records. For guards shaped by ideology, assigning black prisoners to labor offered a convenient way to remove them from view without formally acknowledging their presence. Survival in the camp system was not a single moment of transition. It was an ongoing negotiation. Each day brought new uncertainties: a change of guard commander, a sudden transfer order, a clerical error that erased a fragile entry in a ledger. The precariousness of their position never fully receded. The path leads toward the remains of the infirmary. Only scattered stones remain, but the space feels different, quieter, softened by the memory of suffering. Medical care in POW camps was limited, but the infirmary represented acknowledgement of pain. 4 black prisoners. Even this space was inconsistent. Some received proper care. Some were turned away. Others were examined with a mixture of clinical interest and ideological bias. One rare testimony recalled a German doctor who treated a black prisoner without hesitation, ignoring the surprise of younger guards. Another recounted a medic who refused medicine, muttering a racial epithet as he walked away. The system had no mechanism for correcting these choices. Ideology hovered over each interaction, shaping outcomes quietly, unpredictably. As the path returns toward the center of the camp footprint, the weight of the chapter becomes unmistakable. Black prisoners existed inside this system, but never securely. They occupied a liminal space where ideology collided with protocol, where the simplest routines became unstable, and where survival depended not on procedure but on personalities, contingencies, and chance. Ahead lies Part B, where the inner experiences within these camps come into focus. How these men endured the emotional and psychological landscape of a system that saw them as anomalies and treated them accordingly. Living in the space between recognition and erasure. The path from the old infirmary curves toward what remains of the camp's central yard, a broad rectangle of hardened soil bordered by shallow impressions where barracks once stood. This open space had been the heart of daily life, the place where roll calls formed rigid lines, where guards issued orders, and where prisoners gathered for rations, rumors, or assignments. For most POWs, it represented routine. For black prisoners, it became something else entirely, a stage where their ambiguous place within the system surfaced again and again. Stepping into the yard's footprint, the quiet feels deliberate. The emptiness echoes the structure that once governed every day. Here, a black POW would have existed in a paradox, highly visible to fellow captives, yet nearly invisible within the framework designed to account for their presence. Roll call made this contradiction unmistakable. Rows of prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder while guards read names from stiff notebooks. Most men answered with short, clipped replies. Yet black prisoners often found themselves caught in procedural gaps. Some were skipped because their names were never recorded. Others were questioned repeatedly, as if their presence disrupted the rhythm the guards relied on. One white POW later described watching a black American soldier stand at attention every morning despite never hearing his name called. The guards ignored the omission. They simply moved on, leaving the man suspended in a strange limbo, present in reality, absent on paper, occupying a space the system neither formalized nor corrected. A faint track leads from the yard toward the old ration distribution area, where tin cups once scraped against dented bowls. The rations here were meager, watery soup, coarse bread, but they mattered profoundly. Hunger shaped every hour of captivity. For black prisoners, the ration line often carried an additional layer of tension. Some guards withheld portions or served them with exaggerated caution, acting as though proximity itself defied ideological logic. At times, white comrades quietly intervened, sharing their own bread, switching places so a black soldier could receive a larger ladle of soup, or confronting guards through subtle acts of solidarity. These gestures were small, but in a place where the system minimized certain men, such moments pushed back against erasure. The path dips toward the site of the former workshops, where prisoners once repaired shoes, carved trinkets, or fashioned simple tools. The atmosphere here had been a little lighter, shaped by the comfort of making something in a world that stripped men of agency. A rare testimony tells of a black prisoner who carved small wooden birds during his time in captivity. Smooth, simple figures traded for bread or cigarettes, or given away as quiet gifts. These carvings became more than barter. They were anchors of dignity, pieces of selfhood preserved through skill and patience, unnoticed by guards who walked past without understanding what the work represented. Moving toward the remains of a barracks row, the emotional landscape deepens. The earth still marks where walls rose, where bunks crowded together, where narrow aisles divided sleeping men. Captive life here was shaped by cold, overcrowding, boredom, and the slow erosion of certainty. For black prisoners, those pressures were compounded by isolation. Some barracks welcomed them, others did not. Prejudices carried into captivity did not always dissolve at the camp gates. In some spaces, they hardened. Yet moments of connection emerged. One testimony recalls a black newcomer trembling from hunger as several prisoners avoided him. A white POW, embarrassed by the scene, stood, offered his own blanket, and made space on his bunk. Others followed, shifting the tone of the room in a single gesture. Acts like these rarely made their way into official histories, yet they define the lived reality of men navigating a system that placed them in between. The outline of the exercise yard appears ahead, an open ground where prisoners walked in circles to keep warm, spoke quietly with those they trusted, or stared beyond the wire toward fields they could not reach. 4 black prisoners, this space carried a mix of longing and vigilance. Some guards watched them more closely, as though expecting trouble. Some prisoners observed them with curiosity shaped by unfamiliarity. Yet this yard also held the possibility of human connection. Men traded stories of home, families, music, and the imagined shape of a life after the war. These exchanges softened ideological boundaries, creating brief pockets of normalcy in a place built to diminish individuality. At the edge of the yard, the faint line of the old perimeter fence traces the boundary between captivity and open country. Freedom once lay just beyond the wire, visible, unreachable. Black prisoners stood at this edge too, weighing the complicated truth of their situation. They were trapped in a system that did not fully acknowledge them, yet alive in ways many others, especially those who vanished earlier in the chain of capture, were not permitted to be. The emotional weight of that reality shaped every day. These men lived between categories, in the space where recognition faltered and erasure threatened. They were seen enough to be guarded, but not enough to be granted the full protections of their status. Each day balanced survival against uncertainty, dignity against invisibility. Ahead, the story moves beyond the camp fences, to the labor detachments, forced marches, and collapsing front lines where ideology continued to follow prisoners, shaping their fate until the war's final days. Lapland War, Finland 1944. German engineer placing demolition charges on a wooden bridge, hands steady despite exhaustion, frozen river running below, pale winter sun above, sepia-toned. Collapsed fronts, collapsed protections. The valley narrows into a long, uneven track stretching toward the horizon, framed by skeletal trees and frost-darkened grass. Roads like this appear repeatedly in POW testimonies, the liminal spaces where the boundary between order and chaos blurred as Germany's front collapsed in 1944 and 1945. For most prisoners, the marches that unfolded along these routes were brutal but survivable. 4 black POWs, each kilometer brought heightened danger. The track dips and rises, echoing the terrain of the infamous death marches that marked the war's final phase. As Allied forces advanced, German units scrambled to move their prisoners away from the front, driving thousands across freezing landscapes with little food, shelter, or rest. These marches were part desperation, part refusal, an attempt by a crumbling regime to maintain control of the men it still held captive. 4 black prisoners, whose status had never fit cleanly within the POW system, the collapse of that system exposed new and deeper vulnerabilities. At the outset of each march, guards often sorted prisoners hastily, by nationality, by rank, by physical condition. Any black prisoner present disrupted this fragile sorting process. Guards who had reluctantly tolerated their presence inside the camp now faced the chaos of open roads, collapsing command hierarchies, and escalating ideological fervor. The pressures of retreat sharpened prejudices that had simmered beneath the routines of captivity. Near a patch of churned mud, one testimony recalls a black soldier stumbling during a march in early 1945. He carried a damaged boot tied to his belt. His feet were wrapped in cloth. When he fell, a guard struck him repeatedly until he stood, then struck him again when he struggled to regain balance. The white POW, who later recounted the scene, never learned the man's name. By the end of the day, he had vanished from the column. Such brief appearances and sudden disappearances form the backbone of what little is known about black POWs during the war's final months. Without consistent records, their stories appear only in flashes, moments of extreme cold, moments of courage, and moments where ideology asserted itself violently through the collapse of structure. Farther along, the track widens into a frost-glittered clearing, perhaps a place where a detachment once halted for the night. Prisoners huddled behind broken farm walls, sharing what warmth they could. Some guards relaxed during these stops, offering extra scraps or easing their discipline. Others, threatened by the chaos around them, grew harsher. Black prisoners rarely benefited from leniency. Influenced by ideology, some guards singled them out for heavier burdens, stricter oversight, or arbitrary punishment. And because the marches operated outside formal record-keeping, these acts dissolved into the silence of a retreating army. A faint trail leads from the clearing toward a cluster of ruined foundations, the kind found on the outskirts of rural towns scattered across Germany and occupied Europe. Retreating troops often funneled prisoners into barns, cellars, or abandoned homes for a few hours of shelter. Conditions varied wildly. A handful of prisoners found warmth or food. Others found resentment from civilians or indifference from exhausted guards. One testimony describes a black prisoner collapsing upon arrival at a deserted barn. A white POW helped him to a beam for support. A guard kicked straw over them both, not with kindness, but to conceal that the man was too weak to stand. At dawn, the guard quietly motioned for the white POW to rejoin the column, but made no gesture toward the black prisoner. The barn door closed. The march continued. No record explains what became of him. The ruins hold the shape of such moments, brief elevations of humanity, quickly overshadowed by decisions made in secrecy or neglect. Black prisoners often survived the earliest dangers of capture, endured the holding sites, and navigated the uncertainty of the camps, only to face their greatest risk when the system around them began to fail. Ideology, previously constrained by routine, surfaced with renewed force as oversight evaporated. Guards who might once have hesitated now acted freely. Those deeply tied to the regime's racial worldview used the collapse as an opportunity to express it unfiltered. Farther along, a faint wagon road cuts across a ridge. In the war's final months, many prisoners were moved by open wagons, packed tightly, exposed to wind and snow. Those unable to climb aboard were left behind. Black prisoners were especially vulnerable. Without formal registration, guards sometimes claimed they could not waste space on men whose names were not listed. Such small, unrecorded decisions shaped the final hours of countless lives. From the crest of the ridge, the land opens into a wide sweep of frozen ground. In the mind's eye, a long column threads its way across the field, breaths rising sharply into winter air. A few black figures are visible among the mass, not because the system welcomed them, but because chance, solidarity, or sheer will had carried them this far. The view from this vantage point reveals something fundamental. The collapse of structure did not blunt the force of ideology. It exposed it. With rules eroded and authority fragmented, the quiet violence embedded in the system became more visible, not less. Black prisoners occupied the most fragile position within that disintegration, seen only long enough to be subjected to danger, rarely long enough to be counted. And yet some survived. Their stories emerged in fragments after liberation, spoken to American officers in hoarse voices, written shakily on debriefing forms, or recalled in memoirs by men who shared a march, a night of shelter, or a fleeting conversation with them. These survivors became the rare witnesses who bridged the immense gap between lived experience and historical silence. Ahead, the road bends toward the war's end, toward liberation, return, and the painful reckoning between what happened and what was officially remembered. Liberation, when silence met sunlight. The road widens as it slopes downward, opening into a broad field touched by faint morning light. In the distance, the silhouettes of approaching Allied vehicles seem to gather. Jeeps, half-tracks, ambulances, moving cautiously across uncertain terrain. Liberation often arrived this way. Slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. Not in triumph, but in the quiet recognition that the war's grip on this place had finally weakened. For most POWs, liberation marked the end of hunger, cold, and fear. It meant warmth, food, and the restoration of identity. 4 black prisoners, whose existence had drifted between categories and whose presence the system had struggled to acknowledge. Liberation brought a different kind of revelation. It exposed everything the system had tried to hide. It revealed the silence they had been forced to inhabit. And in some cases, it became the first moment when their ordeal was truly seen. Across the open field, the stillness begins to shift, echoing the atmosphere described in countless testimonies. Many camps entered a strange limbo in the days before liberation. Some German guards fled early, abandoning their captives to cold nights and speculation. Others lingered until the final moment, rifles lowering only when Allied tanks crested the horizon. In certain camps, guards attempted to stage a semblance of order, forcing prisoners to appear cared for, even though the truth showed plainly in hollow faces, torn coats, and trembling hands. Somewhere in that moment stood black prisoners, few in number, exhausted, uncertain whether liberation would recognize them or simply fold them into a broader, more familiar narrative. In testimonies from white POWs, descriptions of liberation often include fleeting mentions of black soldiers emerging from the background, a figure wrapped in a tattered blanket stepping into sunlight for the first time in weeks, a man from a labor detachment limping toward the vehicles, someone who looked almost spectral after months spent without proper rations or documentation. One account recalls a black prisoner standing apart from the group as an American officer began taking names. The officer noticed him, called him forward gently, and asked for his serial number. The man hesitated. He had not spoken it aloud since the day he was captured. When he finally repeated it, his voice sounded distant, as though the number belonged to someone he once knew but no longer resembled. Moments like this likely unfolded across dozens of liberated sites, quiet, understated, deeply significant. For the first time in months, and sometimes longer, these men were being acknowledged by the very army that had once sent them into battle. Near a shallow depression where wagon tracks converge, Allied medics once set up temporary assessment stations. Cold air carried the metallic scent of melting frost as they examined each prisoner, checking for frostbite, malnutrition, infection. Many were almost unrecognizable. The medical reports describe gaunt faces, sunken eyes, trembling limbs. For black prisoners, these assessments often contained an additional note: uncertainty. Some liberators recorded that the men did not appear in the roster, or were not listed in previous camp counts, or had no documentation. Such notations revealed the depth of the silence these men had endured. They had been hidden so thoroughly that even their own army struggled to place them back into its structure. Beside the remnants of a collapsed barn, other stories surface. In one account, a black prisoner crawled from a barn on the day American forces arrived. He was too weak to stand. A white POW helped carry him toward the medics. The man survived long enough to give his name, his unit, and a brief description of his captivity before collapsing from exhaustion. His testimony became one of the rare, direct voices through which historians later pieced together fragments of this forgotten history. These moments show how precarious liberation could be. The war may have ended for these men, but the gaps in their stories remained painfully visible. Farther across the field, the imagined outline of a medical tent rises, bright canvas catching the sunlight, red cross markings crisp against the white. Inside such tents, liberated prisoners received their first real care in months. Here, One can picture a black soldier lying beneath a blanket, exhaustion etched across his face. A medic offers water. Another notes symptoms on a clipboard: dehydration, exposure, severe fatigue. Sometimes the man spoke of where he had been held. Sometimes he said nothing, too tired or too wary to revisit the unrecorded past. Some liberators later wrote that black prisoners seemed reluctant to describe their treatment, not because they chose secrecy, but because they sensed how fragile their experiences sounded in a world unprepared to hear them. Their stories lacked paperwork, lacked verification, lacked the structural frame that made other narratives easier to confirm. At a low ridge where two tracks intersect, prisoners were often sorted for repatriation. White American soldiers moved through a familiar process: identification, brief questioning, food, onward transport. Black prisoners sometimes required additional steps: confirming identities, tracing units, correcting assumptions. One officer later admitted his surprise upon meeting a black POW who spoke fluent English and carried an American dog tag. He had believed, mistakenly, that black soldiers did not serve in certain capacities. His disbelief revealed the broader assumptions of the segregated era, not anything about the man standing before him. Even in liberation, ideology did not disappear at once. Some American officers approached black prisoners with the same biases they carried before the war. Processing could be slower. Questions could be sharper. Yet many other liberators greeted them with warmth, recognizing how unlikely their survival had been and how deeply the system had failed them. The liberation field holds both relief and unfinished business. The war was ending. The guards were gone. The machinery that had erased these men was collapsing. Yet the silence surrounding their captivity lingered, waiting to be confronted, remembered, and spoken aloud. Ahead lies Part B, where the story moves into the immediate aftermath: what was recorded, what was forgotten, and what slipped back into silence even after freedom arrived. After the gates open, reclaiming identity in fragments. The liberation field recedes as the path turns toward a cluster of low hills where Allied repatriation centers once operated. These were not camps, nor holding sites, nor prisons. They were transitional spaces, temporary hubs where liberated soldiers were fed, examined, questioned, and placed on the long route home. The atmosphere held a muted blend of relief and exhaustion, disbelief at survival, cautious hope for recovery, and the quiet fear that some wounds, physical or otherwise, might never fully heal. For black prisoners, these centers marked a return to formal visibility. Yet even here, their stories rarely fit neatly into the forms or procedures prepared for them. The outline of an old inspection tent appears near a patch of flattened soil. Allied medics once moved briskly through this space, scribbling notes on clipboards, checking pulses, bandaging wounds. Simple acts, water offered, hands steadied, felt monumental after months of deprivation. But when a black soldier stepped into such a tent, medics sometimes hesitated, flipping through rosters that did not contain his name. The hesitation was not personal. It was structural. Their own paperwork had inherited the erasure imposed by the German system. Men who had survived hidden pathways through captivity now confronted an administrative world unsure where to place them. One report describes a black survivor known only by a nickname because no official record of his capture existed. A medic, searching for reference and finding none, wrote across the top of the form, "Unregistered POW, American." Those 3 words encapsulated the paradox: a man present and alive, yet almost undocumented. A shallow trench nearby once served as the processing queue. Here, liberated prisoners waited to speak with intelligence officers gathering information about camp conditions. White prisoners often provided structured accounts: stalag numbers, guard names, dates, routines. Black survivors struggled to fit their experiences into these categories, not from lack of memory, but because their captivity had unfolded outside the architecture those questions assumed. They had been moved irregularly, held in unmarked sites, interrogated without documentation, or marched through spaces that were never given official designation. Some could not name where they had been held. Others described locations that matched no known maps. Officers, unprepared for such anomalies, marked the reports as incomplete. Farther ahead stands the footprint of a larger stone building, perhaps once a field hospital or administrative center. Inside these walls, officers conducted formal debriefings, gathering accounts of German troop movements and POW treatment. These interviews later became valuable historical sources. In these rooms, a handful of black survivors offered quiet, understated testimony. They spoke of cold nights, isolation, scarcity, rare moments of kindness, and sudden acts of cruelty. They described guards who treated them as curiosities or as threats, and fellow prisoners who had stepped in to protect them. Yet many testimonies broke off abruptly, not because memory failed, but because the system had never provided them with names of places, commandants, or structures. Their captivity took place in the undefined spaces of the war, driven more by ideology than by documented military procedure. In the center of the building's remains, the air feels hushed. It is easy to imagine a black survivor sitting across from an Allied officer, recounting his experience with restrained clarity while the officer listened, making notes. But the form in front of him, fields labeled camp number, work detail, commandant, offered no box for his reality. The officer left entire sections blank, adding one more layer of silence atop the many already accumulated. Outside the building's outline stretches an open yard where repatriated POWs once gathered before transport. Some sat in small groups, speaking softly. Others stared at the sky or at nothing at all. Among them sat black survivors, thin, tired, sometimes hesitant to join the circle, unsure how their presence would be received now that the war had ended. A few testimonies describe moments of quiet humanity. One former POW recalled seeing a black soldier sitting alone, head bowed, until a group of Americans waved him over. "You're one of us," one said. "Come on." It was a simple gesture, but it cut through the alienation of months lived at the margins. Not all moments unfolded so gently. Some accounts note that black prisoners were processed last, or placed in separate lines, or given different instructions. The segregation entrenched in the U.S. military followed them even into liberation, producing a jarring contrast with the shared suffering they had endured inside captivity. The road leaving the repatriation site stretches toward distant ports and staging areas. Trucks once rolled along it carrying liberated men toward the first chapter of their return home. For black survivors, these journeys often became their first opportunity to speak freely to fellow Americans about what had happened. Some recounted their stories to chaplains, medics, or other soldiers. Others remained silent, unsure whether their accounts, lacking documentation, lacking witnesses, lacking structure, would be believed. One chaplain recorded the words of a black survivor who said quietly, "I don't think anyone will understand where I was." The chaplain wrote in his diary, "I believed him." That sentence, simple, resonant, captures the central challenge of post-liberation life for black POWs, reclaiming identity after months spent in the shadows of a system designed not to see them. Ahead, the landscape opens toward the final chapters of the story: post-war memory, reconstruction of evidence, and the long struggle to pull these erased histories back into the light. After the war, a story that faded too quickly. The road leading away from the repatriation centers stretches into quiet countryside, where the last traces of wartime movement dissolve into open fields and soft, rolling hills. This landscape carries none of the war's tension. Farmhouses repaired their roofs. Villagers coaxed crops back into depleted soil. roads once crowded with convoys and prisoners returned to silence. The world had begun its rush toward reconstruction. In that rush, some wartime stories were embraced immediately. Others were carefully archived. And some, like the experiences of black POWs, began to slip back into the shadows almost before they were fully spoken. Beside a field bordered by a low stone wall, the continuity of ordinary life seems almost serene. But for the men who had been erased by the POW system, that return to normalcy was far more complicated. The silence that had defined their captivity followed them into peace. When black survivors reached Allied staging areas, they were fed, examined, and assigned to ships or planes homeward. Medical personnel checked for frostbite, malnutrition, and infection. Chaplains offered cigarettes and quiet blessings. Yet the administrative structure meant to record their wartime service was still shaped by the segregated assumptions that had shaped their deployment. The result was predictable. Their experiences entered the official record unevenly, incompletely, or not at all. Along a narrow path through a grove of bare trees, imagine a column of repatriated soldiers making their way toward a transport truck. Among them might be a black engineer who survived a labor detachment, or a medic who endured weeks in an unregistered holding site. Each man carried a story shaped by absence, missing names, missing places, missing records. When they attempted to describe their captivity, they sometimes met disbelief. Officers encouraged reports, but the forms, camp number, commandant's name, dates of transfer, reflected a system that had never acknowledged their existence. Many survivors left entire sections blank. Others wrote what little they could, aware their words carried less authority without corroboration. At the edge of a clearing, a simple wooden signpost once marked the start of a repatriation road. It is gone now, but the place still feels like a threshold, a symbolic crossing from prisonerhood back into citizenship. Men stepped through it believing they were returning to recognition, dignity, and belonging. For black survivors, however, the return led back into a segregated America, one where military honors, public recognition, and even access to veterans' benefits were distributed unevenly. Some were welcomed warmly at home. Others found their captivity dismissed, doubted, or quietly ignored. One black veteran returned to his southern hometown and was told by a local official that his power count didn't sound right, because few believed black soldiers had ever been taken prisoner. The man later recalled, "I stopped explaining it. I just said I was in the war." A rise in the landscape offers a view over wide fields that meet the horizon, an ideal vantage point for seeing how memory formed in the years after the war. Historians began collecting testimonies immediately. They gathered records, interviewed survivors, catalogued camp structures, and reconstructed escape routes. But their methods were built on paperwork, transfer lists, camp rosters, commandant logs, none of which had included the men whose identities the German system had erased. When researchers looked for black POWs in the archives, they found almost nothing. The absence was misinterpreted as rarity, then anomaly, then, incorrectly, as proof that very few black soldiers had ever been taken captive. Near a low embankment where a rail line once ran, transportation officers once loaded liberated prisoners onto trains bound for ports and airfields. White POWs appeared in shipping rosters with full entries. Black POWs often appeared as nameless tick marks appended after the fact. The gap between lived experience and recorded history widened with every missing detail. In one rare case, a black survivor later discovered that the U.S. Army listed him as missing for nearly a year after he returned home. "I was home for months before they realized I was alive," he said, half amused and half weary. Crossing the old rail bed, the path enters a gentler landscape, warm light, soft grass, a sense of stories ready to settle into collective memory. But memory favors what is written, reinforced, and rooted in established narratives. Black POW experiences lacked those anchors. Yet the silence was never absolute. A handful of survivors gave interviews decades later. A few historians traced footnotes and obscure references until patterns emerged. Some families preserved diaries, letters, and photographs. These fragments, small, fragile, but persistent, became the foundation for reconstructing what had happened. The path bends once more, opening the way toward the final chapters, where post-war memory meets modern research, where names long obscured re-enter the historical record, and where the story of these forgotten POWs begins to come into focus at last. The long silence. Decades without a record. The landscape softens into gentle contours as the post-war decades come into focus. A quiet countryside where the scars of conflict have faded into farmland and open fields. This is the terrain where memory rests, where stories either take root or drift away. And for the black prisoners whose captivity was barely recorded, the silence did not end with liberation. It simply changed shape. It settled into the gaps where history relies on documentation, and where documentation never existed. An old hedgerow runs along the path, its branches grown wild, shaped by years of wind and neglect. It mirrors the story itself, alive, persistent, but twisting in directions no one intended. After the war, governments rushed to collect official histories. Veterans filed claims. Families searched for answers. Monuments were raised. The story of POWs took on a structured form in the collective memory, narratives of endurance, deprivation, escape, and return. But the men erased by the German system, those never registered at capture, never logged in Baroque lists, never accounted for in labor detachments, slipped through the post-war bureaucracy almost unnoticed. Their absence became self-reinforcing. If they did not appear in German archives or Allied POW registries, then for most historians, they simply weren't there. A small stone bridge crosses a slow-moving stream. The water carries fragments of leaves and sediment without rhythm, much like the fragments through which the stories of black POWs survived. A stray interview, a brief memoir passage, a line in a letter, an offhand mention in a debriefing. No official framework preserved their experiences. Only chance did. During the 1950s and 1960s, as global attention shifted toward the Cold War, the POW narrative hardened around camps with extensive documentation. Stalag Luft 3, Orflog 4C, Stalag 9B. Historians mapped escape tunnels, analyzed food parcels, reconstructed transfer routes. These stories centered overwhelmingly on white American and British prisoners whose presence had been meticulously logged. Black prisoners were absent from this literature not by intent but by structure. Without paperwork, their experiences remained invisible to the places historians were trained to look. On the stone bridge, the soft flow of the water suggests how memory was shaped more by silence than speech. Families tried to understand why returning loved ones could not explain where they had been held. Some survivors spoke of their captivity, only to be met with doubt. Others chose silence, sensing that their fragmented accounts did not match what the world believed POW life to be. A few veterans wrote letters to the army seeking confirmation of their imprisonment. Many received replies stating that no such record existed. Eventually, many stopped asking. Beyond the bridge, a grove of thin, straight trees rises into filtered light. This is the quiet domain of oral history, where the official record gives way to memory shared decades later. In the 1970s and 1980s, as scholars and activists documented black military service, they occasionally encountered unexpected stories. Men who calmly described being taken prisoner in Europe during the war. Their accounts surprised the interviewers, who had been taught that black POWs were statistically insignificant or non-existent. Yet the stories carried unmistakable authenticity, the textures of barracks air, the bitter cold of winter marches, the uneasy stares of guards uncertain how to categorize the men they had captured. Still, these testimonies appeared only in footnotes or brief asides. Too scattered, too fragile, too few to reshape the established historical narrative. The grove opens into a wide field where the sun casts long evening shadows. This is where the story begins to shift. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, historians re-examined neglected aspects of the war. They noticed the inconsistencies. Why were there gaps in German camp rosters? Why did liberation reports mention prisoners not listed anywhere? Why did American casualty and missing person records not align? Some scholars began asking new questions. They traced the scattered testimonies, mapping them against known troop movements and camp evacuations. They examined inconsistencies that earlier historians had overlooked. Slowly, patterns emerged. Not a complete picture, but unmistakable evidence that black POWs had existed in far greater numbers than official records suggested. Their absence from archives was not proof of rarity. It was proof of erasure. A low ridge rises at the edge of the field, offering a quiet vantage over the landscape. From here, the long arc of the story becomes clearer. The truth had always been present, hidden beneath layers of missing paperwork, racial ideology, and institutional neglect. It simply required a different kind of inquiry, a willingness to treat silence as a clue rather than a void. At the top of the ridge, the view opens to the horizon. This is where the final phase of the narrative begins, the modern effort to restore names, recover testimonies, and bring to light the men whose survival was nearly lost to history. The silence is finally lifting, not on its own, but because people began asking why it existed at all. Reconstructing a lost record. The path rises into open air and settles along a gentle ridge overlooking a landscape where the present and the past seem to lean into each other. Below, the countryside lies in quiet folds of farmland, forest, and small towns, ordinary places that once bore witness to extraordinary silences. This is where the work of reconstruction begins, decades after the war, after the men who survived captivity returned home and tried to rebuild their lives in the aftermath. From the ridge, the horizon stretches wide and unbroken. Somewhere beneath that open space lie the stories that never entered official archives, the names missing from German ledgers, the faces absent from American repatriation lists, the men whose wartime journeys were disrupted not only by capture but by erasure. The entire effort began with a question that refused to settle. Why were so few black POWs recorded, when tens of thousands of black soldiers had served near front lines where capture was common? The numbers did not align. The lists of dead were known. The deployment maps were documented. Black soldiers fought in positions where surrender and encirclement occurred often. Yet the POW rosters, German and Allied alike, barely reflected their presence. That discrepancy became the starting point for a new kind of historical inquiry, one that treated absence itself as the first piece of evidence. In a nearby clearing, a weathered stone stands alone, moss gathering around its base. It resembles a memorial, though no inscription remains. It symbolizes the initial challenge faced by researchers, the need to acknowledge that the disappearance of black POWs from official records was not random error, but the product of ideology, prejudice, and the disorder of a collapsing regime. To trace these lost stories, historians moved beyond traditional archives. They searched the diaries of white POWs for fleeting references to black comrades. They sifted through captured German field orders that hinted at special prisoners or invoked racial designations. They interviewed aging veterans who had long stored memories in silence, unsure whether anyone wanted to hear them. One soldier recalled marching beside a black prisoner for only 2 days before guards removed the man from the column. The recollection survived not because of detailed conversation, but because the prisoner's presence had felt so unusual, and because his disappearance was so sudden. That brief moment, nearly lost, became a crucial thread. A dry creek bed cuts across the clearing, a narrow channel carved into the soil by water long gone. It mirrors the way testimonies drifted into the historical record, thin, fragile streams of memory carving paths through decades of silence. When combined, they revealed a broader pattern. Black soldiers were captured far more frequently than official documentation suggested, but their fates diverged dramatically from the documented paths followed by white POWs. Near the creek bed, a circle of stones lies half buried in the earth, an accidental arrangement that evokes the shape of a research circle. Here, modern scholars piece together fragments, assembling a mosaic where the original image had been deliberately obscured. Some examined the treatment of French colonial troops in 1940, discovering chilling parallels to what later occurred with Black Americans. Others compared U.S. casualty lists with German regional reports, uncovering discrepancies that pointed toward undocumented captivity. Little by little, names emerged. A soldier never listed in a camp roster, but remembered by his family as having been taken prisoner. A truck driver recalled by comrades, but absent from German files. A medic mentioned in one line of a fading letter written by a white POW. A Caribbean-born volunteer with a free French who returned home alive, though historians had long classified him as missing. Each name was a fragment. Together, they began to form a tapestry. Standing within the ring of stones, the task of reconstruction becomes clear. Historians were not simply collecting data, they were restoring human presence to a landscape shaped by deliberate and accidental erasure. Their work demanded patience, a willingness to accept incomplete stories, and a careful reading of the silences between the facts. Some researchers traced the movements of German divisions that had operated near Black American units. Others studied the correspondence of the International Red Cross, noticing inconsistencies in camp reports that suggested unregistered prisoners. The breakthrough did not come from a single discovery, but from recognizing the pattern hidden inside the inconsistencies. Across regions, units, months, and records, the same void reappeared. That void was the evidence. It revealed a truth long obscured. The German POW system had not integrated these men, had not protected them, and in many cases had not allowed them to survive long enough to be recorded. From the ridge, the horizon feels like a threshold between understanding and denial. 4 years, this conclusion met resistance. It challenged sanitized narratives of the Wehrmacht. It forced historians to confront the racial ideology embedded in its practices. It raised painful questions about how many stories had been lost before anyone even thought to ask what had happened. Yet with every recovered name, every preserved testimony, the silence receded a little further. Ahead lies Part B, where the work of restoration deepens, where lost names are reclaimed, where survivors are honored, and where the truth finally emerges, late but unmistakable. Restoring the names, the slow return of the forgotten. The clearing narrows into a path bordered by small, weathered stones, each one catching the muted afternoon light. The setting feels almost ceremonial, a quiet walkway where memory gathers in fragments and where lost names gradually rise from beneath decades of silence. The effort to reconstruct the history of Black POWs did not end with scattered testimonies. It grew into a broader mission, to honor the men who vanished from the record, to recover the names nearly erased, and to understand the true scale of their disappearance. As the path unfolds, the surrounding stillness carries a subtle heaviness. It reflects the lives tied to the ground beneath it, men whose identities slipped from official view, families who never received answers, histories shaped by absence rather than acknowledgement. Modern scholars approached that silence with patience and humility. They knew the picture would never be complete, but they refused to allow incompleteness to become a justification for forgetting. Every recollection, every archival inconsistency, every footnote became a thread worth following. Some of those threads led to remarkable rediscoveries. In Illinois, a researcher interviewed the daughter of a black truck driver long listed as missing. She preserved one photograph of him taken before the war and a brief note written in his unsteady hand. "I was taken prisoner, but not for long." That scrap of testimony, paired with a white POWs recollection, finally placed him near an improvised holding site in Belgium, an area previously thought undocumented. In France, a historian uncovered a list of unregistered laborers assigned to a German supply depot near Metz. 2 names belonged to black American soldiers reported missing by their units. Though absent from POW files, the labor roster confirmed their capture. A British scholar examining colonial military archives found a letter folded inside an old notebook. It came from a veteran who described a black American sharing a bunk in a temporary barracks for 2 nights before being moved elsewhere. The letter ended with a quiet final line. He deserved to be remembered. Each discovery illuminated one life. Together, they pointed to a far larger truth. The stone-lined path continues, and the arrangement of rocks seems to echo uncarved inscriptions. Not literal names, only the impression of them. The kind of presence that lingers when a life has been lived, lost, and is now slowly returning to history. One of the most significant shifts in modern research came from accepting a difficult premise. The German POW system was never structured to include black prisoners. The erasure was not accidental. It was ideological. And once that framework was acknowledged, silence became a form of evidence. Historians mapped the positions of black American units during major offensives, compared U.S. casualty lists with regional German records, and cross-referenced testimonies from American, British, French, and German sources. With each triangulated detail, previously unseen patterns emerged. Regions where black soldiers were almost certainly held, paths where records should have existed but had been intentionally left blank or destroyed. This method, treating absence as data, became an act of restoration. Farther along the path, a semicircle of larger stones forms a natural memorial. It evokes the names recovered in recent decades, spoken aloud at small ceremonies, included in digital archives, or printed in modest memorial publications. Some of these names belong to survivors who never shared their stories publicly. Others belong to men who died in captivity, their fates reconstructed through fragments. Still others remain partially anonymous, identified only by a description or a single remembered detail. Together, they form a quiet constellation. James Hendricks, Lawrence Neal, Samuel Carter, a medic remembered only as Red, a driver known as Slim, a French West African soldier called Musa, whose family searched for answers that never came, and countless others whose names remain just beyond reach. Beyond the memorial stones, the path opens into bare soil where the narrative widens from individual recovery to collective recognition. Museums, archives, and educational institutions have begun to acknowledge the existence and the suffering of black POWs, integrating their stories into exhibitions, documentaries, and historical studies. These efforts cannot fill every gap, but they challenge the long silence that once defined this history. Families have learned, sometimes for the first time, that a relative survived captivity. Others discovered what likely happened to men lost to wartime ambiguity. Some veterans, late in life, finally spoke about their experiences, softly, hesitantly, adding depth and clarity to a past they had once carried alone. At the edge of the ridge, the valley opens beneath fading sunlight. The view captures the emotional core of this restoration, a recognition that silence itself was part of the harm. These men were denied power protections, denied the dignity of documentation, denied the historical space granted to others. To recover their names, even decades later, is to return something that was taken from them long before peace arrived. Ahead lies the final stage of the script, the calm, reflective aftermath, where the strands of history settle, where the forgotten are honored, and where the viewer is guided gently toward the closing cadence of the story. Aftermath, where silence leaves its shadow. The valley settles into stillness as the story reaches its quiet end. The air carries no urgency now, only the steady calm that follows long journeys into difficult terrain. The war has receded, the archives have been opened, and the fragments of forgotten lives have been gathered into as much shape as history will allow. Yet the silence that surrounded these men does not vanish with the telling. It lingers, soft and persistent, a reminder of how easily a life can slip out of the frame built to remember it. Across the landscape, the traces of captivity blur into one another, holding sites reduced to irregular depressions in the earth, camp outlines faded into winter grass, abandoned roads sinking slowly back into soil. These were the places where black prisoners endured a captivity the records never learned how to name. Their footsteps once marked these paths, but the ground absorbed them too quickly, leaving historians decades later to search for what could no longer be seen. What remains instead is something more delicate, the knowledge that survival alone did not guarantee remembrance. Many who lived through captivity returned home with stories shaped as much by erasure as by endurance. Some carried quiet pride that they had endured the worst the war could offer. Others carried unanswered questions, shaped by experiences the world around them was not prepared to understand. Their stories drifted at the edges of official accounts, present in fragments, absent in form. Late in life, a few found the words to describe what had happened. They spoke of cold marches, uncertain nights, and guards whose beliefs shaped each day's fate. They spoke of solidarity, too, of white and colonial prisoners who refused to let them stand alone, of quiet gestures that offered a shield against a system built to exclude them. These memories arrived not as polished narratives, but as gentle disclosures, a sentence, a moment, a detail carried through decades of silence. Their testimonies did not restore the full record, but they shifted the landscape of what could be known. Historians learned to read the gaps, to see absence as evidence, to understand that the story of the war was always larger than the archives that claimed to contain it. Over time, this new approach allowed a different truth to emerge, a truth not of perfect documentation, but of humane recognition. In the clearing below, one might imagine a group of names forming a quiet circle, not yet complete but no longer lost. Some are confirmed by testimonies. Some are linked to partial records. Some survive only in memory, traced through the recollections of those who marched beside them or glimpsed them across a yard. Each name restores a small part of what history allowed to slip away. Each name shifts the balance, turning silence into acknowledgement. Beyond the clearing, the path continues toward the broader world, the world these men once returned to with exhaustion still in their bones. They stepped back into towns and cities reshaped by the war, carrying experiences that did not fit the assumptions of a segregated society. Some found understanding, others found disbelief. Many learned quickly that the world was more prepared to accept their absence than the truth of their captivity. And yet their stories endured, moving quietly through families, whispered in living rooms, tucked into letters, remembered by children and grandchildren who sensed there was something more beneath the words. These fragments, preserved across decades, became the foundation for restoring the narrative long denied them. The restoration came late, but it came, slow, deliberate, and anchored in a growing willingness to confront the silence itself. The valley grows darker as evening settles over the ridge. What remains is not a complete account, nor a perfect reconstruction. It is something more honest, a recognition of the lives that slipped past the margins, the courage that went unrecorded, and the truth that waited patiently for someone to ask where it had gone. The story settles into its final quiet, a space where the forgotten stand once more in the light, not fully visible, but no longer unseen. Their presence lingers in the air like the last breath of daylight before night fully arrives. Their names, restored piece by piece, reclaim the place history withheld from them, and in this closing stillness, the past becomes a companion rather than a shadow, reminding those who listen that even the quietest stories carry the weight of whole worlds. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.